In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. O hearts that seek truth, O eyes that weep for the oppressed, O souls awakened by the call of justice. We have entered the sacred month of Muharram al-Haram, the first month of the Islamic calendar. But this is no ordinary beginning. This is not a time of celebration or festivity. This is a time when history cries, when heaven mourns, and when every believer's chest tightens with pain. Because Muharram begins with remembrance. It begins with blood. It begins with Karbala. On the first of Muharram, Imam Hussain ibn Ali, the beloved grandson of the Holy Prophet, arrived in the barren land of Karbala. He was not welcomed by flowers but by swords. He did not find peace but a storm of betrayal. And yet, he did not turn back. He planted his tents on that dry earth, knowing this would be the land of his martyrdom. Knowing that every drop of blood spilled here would become a river of light for the oppressed of every era. Karbala is not just a place. It is a message. It is the voice of Hussain echoing through time saying, if you see truth being buried, rise, even if you stand alone. It is the lesson that faith is not proven by silence. It is proven by sacrifice. In Karbala, there were only 72 standing against thousands. But they had something the enemy never could. They had certainty, loyalty, and divine purpose. Each of them wrote their names in the book of eternity, not with ink, but with their blood. Ali Akbar, the son whose face shined like the prophet. Qasim, the young nephew who longed for martyrdom. Abbas, the flag bearer whose loyalty was unmatched. And the infant Ali Askar, whose silent martyrdom shook the throne of Allah. And at the heart of it all stood Hussain, alone, wounded, grieving, yet unbroken. He stood not because he hoped to win the battle, but because he refused to surrender to falsehood. His last prostration on the burning sands of Karbala was not the end, it was the beginning. Because from that sajda, Islam rose again, not in power, but in purity. And let us not forget Zainab and Sak, the sister of Hussain, the voice of Karbala. When the swords were silent, it was her words that roared. When the enemies thought the story had ended, she began it. From the throne of Yazid's court, she declared the truth. Not with an army, but with dignity. Because Karbala teaches you truth does not die when the swords fall. It lives when the tongues rise. O believers, Muharram is not just for tears. It is for transformation. Cry for Hussain, yes, but also walk in his footsteps. Don't just wear black on your clothes. Wear his courage on your soul. Don't just beat your chest. Awaken your conscience. Stand with the oppressed. Speak for the voiceless. Resist injustice in all its forms. The month of Muharram is sacred because it holds the pain of the Prophet's household. But it is also powerful because it reminds us that one stand can change the world. Hussain did not die in Karbala. He lives in every heart that refuses to bow to tyranny. So let us raise our hands not just in mourning, but in prayer. Let us bow our heads not just in sorrow, but in submission to the truth Hussain gave his life for. Let Karbala live in us every day, in every choice, in every breath. Ya Hussain!
On the 2nd of Muharram in the year 61 AH, Imam Hussain A.S. reached the plain of Karbala, a moment that marked the beginning of the final phase in his journey of resistance. As he approached the area, he asked about the name of the land. When told it was called Karbala, he stopped and declared that this was the destined place where his blood would be shed. The choice to halt at Karbala was not accidental or driven by fatigue or coincidence. It was deeply rooted in divine knowledge and prophecy. Imam Hussain A.S., the grandson of the Holy Prophet Muhammad S.A.W., knew well that his mission would culminate on this land. It was part of the divine plan that the sacrifice of truth, dignity, and resistance against tyranny would be immortalized in Karbala. The journey to Karbala was long and filled with signs that danger and betrayal lay ahead. The Imam had received numerous letters from the people of Kufa, pledging their allegiance and urging him to come and lead them in opposition to Yazid's corrupt rule. Trusting their words, and more importantly, responding to his divine responsibility to uphold justice, Imam Hussain A.S. set out with his family and followers. However, he remained cautious throughout the journey, sending his cousin Muslim ibn Aqil ahead to assess the situation in Kufa. By the time Imam Hussain reached Karbala, he was already aware that Muslim had been martyred and that the political winds in Kufa had shifted dramatically against him. Despite the danger, Imam Hussain A.S. did not turn back. On reaching Karbala, he made the conscious decision to stop. Historians narrate that he dismounted and ordered his caravan to set camp. The land was desolate and barren, dry earth, no fortifications, and minimal resources. Yet he recognized it as the very land of his martyrdom, where the prophecy of his grandfather would unfold. It is said that Imam Hussain A.S. even purchased a portion of the land from the local tribe of Banu Asad, so that his burial would be lawful. This act symbolizes that even in death, the Imam upheld the highest moral and ethical standards. The arrival at Karbala also marked a spiritual and emotional turning point. The family of the Prophet, including women and children, now knew with certainty that they were stepping into a place of no return. Imam Hussain A.S. was deeply aware of what awaited him and his companions, yet his face bore no signs of regret or fear. Instead, there was serenity, resolve, and submission to the will of Allah. His decision to stay in Karbala was not just a pause in his journey. It was a conscious stand against the corruption of the Umayyad regime. It was a declaration that he would not give allegiance to tyranny, even if it cost him his life and the lives of those dearest to him. As he set up camp, the first encounters with the enemy forces began. Umar ibn Saud had arrived with Yazid's army, and although initial exchanges were non-violent, the tension was unmistakable. Imam Hussain A.S. took time to prepare his companions mentally, emotionally, and spiritually for the days to come. He delivered sermons reminding them of the purpose of their stand and the inevitability of their fate. For the Imam, every step, every moment in Karbala was a manifestation of divine justice and moral courage. The journey to Karbala did not begin with weapons or a desire for conquest. It began with a letter, with a cry for leadership, and with the pain of a society drowning in silence and submission. Imam Hussain A.S. did not rise to gain control of a kingdom or to amass wealth. His every step from Medina to Makkah, and then toward Kufa, was taken with one purpose: to revive a truth that had been buried under the weight of fear, corruption, and falsehood. It was a mission of reform, a journey of sacrifice, and a declaration that the message of the Prophet letter F. DFA would not be distorted without resistance. In a time when the name of Islam was being used to justify oppression, when the Ummah had grown numb under the rule of a tyrant, and when people preferred silence over truth, the grandson of Prophet could not remain seated. He had to rise not for battle, but for awakening. His movement was one of clarity in an age of confusion. His call was not to the sword, but to the soul. He knew that reform could not happen without pain, and that sacrifice was the price of revival. When Hussain A.S. left Makkah, it was during the sacred month. Even then, he did not rush into conflict. He wrote letters, he warned people. He made his intentions clear, that he sought to revive the path of his grandfather and reform the nation of his father, Ali ibn Abi Talib. He met people on the road and advised them to leave if they feared what lay ahead. Even when companions joined him, he told them plainly that death would be the likely outcome. What kind of leader tells his followers that the path ahead is filled with blood and thirst? Only the one who does not lie, who does not manipulate, who is driven not by power, but by purpose. The closer Hussain came to Karbala, the more obvious the danger became, yet he did not turn back, not because he was stubborn, but because turning back would have meant endorsing falsehood. His stand was not one of revenge, it was a stand to protect the essence of Islam. Yazid's rule threatened to redefine what Islam meant, replacing justice with tyranny, modesty with corruption, and mercy with brutality. Hussain refused to let that transformation go unchallenged. Even as he was intercepted and forced into the barren land of Karbala, Hussain maintained his grace. He continued to speak with dignity. He tried every peaceful means possible. He offered reminders of the Prophet. He appealed to the hearts of those who opposed him. But when all roads closed, when the enemy chose blood over reason, he prepared not for victory, but for testimony. The battlefield was not his destination. It was the stage upon which he would declare, through his sacrifice, that the truth is not for sale, and that the blood of the righteous would water roots of awakening for generations to come. Hussain knew that his martyrdom would be misunderstood by some and glorified by others. But he trusted Allah. He knew that the story of Karbala would not end with the swords that pierced his body, but would begin with the tears that would flow from the eyes of those who truly understood. His blood was not spilled for war, it was offered for remembrance. His stand was not for political control, it was to remind the Ummah of what they had forgotten, that Islam is about standing with the oppressed, speaking against the unjust, and refusing to be silent when truth is trampled under the boots of power. The scorching sun of the 2nd of Muharram cast long shadows on the desert plains of Karbala as a caravan approached, tired, small in number, but mighty in purpose. It was on this day that Imam Hussain ibn Ali, the grandson of the Holy Prophet F, DFA, arrived at the land that would become the greatest battlefield between truth and falsehood. As the horses halted and the dust began to settle, Hussain looked out over the barren earth and asked, "What is this place called?" They told him, "It is called Karbala." His eyes darkened with grief, and he replied, "This is a place of sorrow and trial, Karb and Bala." The weight of destiny had arrived. But Hussain did not come to Karbala as a warrior seeking conquest. He came as a man of peace, a reformer, a guardian of prophetic values. He was forced to stop at this place, surrounded by an army sent by a tyrant who could not tolerate truth. The enemy wanted his pledge of allegiance, a signature of submission that would give legitimacy to corruption and brutality. But Hussain could never bend to falsehood. His back was straight with the dignity of faith, and his feet were firm with the courage of divine purpose. As tents were pitched on the sand and the small group of loyal companions dismounted, the camp of Hussain began to take shape, not as a military base, but as a moral fortress. The companions knew that this would be their final destination, yet no one turned back. In fact, the air was not filled with fear, but with spiritual stillness. Prayers echoed across the camp, voices soft but steady. Mothers tended to their children. The youth looked to Hussain with eyes full of love and readiness. There was no panic, only preparation for sacrifice, for legacy, for eternity. The 2nd of Muharram was the beginning of the final chapter. From that moment the countdown to the day of Ashura had begun. The enemy's forces began to grow day by day, while the camp of Hussain remained small and isolated. Yet in that little camp, truth rested, justice lived. Islam in its purest form stood under the shade of cloth tents, under the leadership of a man who would not surrender his soul to save his body. Hussain did not just arrive in Karbala on this day, he brought the soul of Islam with him. He knew that the land on which he stood would soon be soaked with the blood of his loved ones. He knew that the children in the camp would soon cry not from mischief, but from thirst. He knew that his sister Zainab would face captivity, and that the heads of his family would be raised on spears. But he also knew that this was necessary, not because Allah wanted his pain, but because humanity needed this lesson. The Ummah had forgotten, hearts had hardened, the call to prayer was still recited, but its meaning was being lost. The Quran was still recited, but justice was being violated. Karbala would remind them. The arrival on the 2nd of Muharram was not marked by fanfare or flags, it was marked by silent strength. It was a quiet entry onto a stage that would host the loudest message in human history. And as the days passed and the enemy tightened their grip, Hussain remained calm. His companions remained loyal. The children of his household remained noble. This was not just a journey to a location. It was a journey to a divine stand, a moment in history that would never die. Every step Hussain took on that burning earth was a step that carved the path of truth into the soil of time. On the 2nd of Muharram, as Imam Hussain and his small caravan settled in the desolate land of Karbala, a storm began to gather on the horizon. Not a storm of rain or mercy, but one of iron, spears, and oppression. The army of Yazid, the embodiment of a corrupt and crumbling empire, began surrounding the camp of truth with calculated cruelty. What began as a peaceful encampment for a handful of souls soon became the center of a siege that would mark the turning point of human history. The soldiers poured in like a flood, not to defend justice, but to suppress it. They did not come to listen to the grandson of the prophet letter F, DFA, they came to silence him. The sound of hooves, the clang of armor, the banners of tyranny, these became the backdrop to Karbala. One after another, regiments of Yazid's army filled the plains, first 1,000, then more. Eventually, their numbers would swell to over 30,000. Yet all this might, all this intimidation, was directed at a man who had no throne, no army, no fortress, only the truth, and the purest companions ever gathered. What fear did they have of this man that required such overwhelming force? What was so dangerous about Hussain that power itself shook in his presence? They feared the clarity of his message. They feared the light of his lineage. They feared that even a few words from his lips could ignite hearts across the empire. And so they surrounded him, not just physically, but with silence, threats, and the cruel strategy of starvation. The siege was not just a military maneuver, it was a message, bow or bleed. Yet Hussain had made it clear from the start, humiliation was not an option. Submission to a tyrant who drank in the name of Islam, who mocked the Sunnah, who slaughtered innocents with impunity, was worse than death. As the enemy camp expanded, their horses crushed the sand beneath them, while in Hussain's camp, children played unaware of what awaited them. The mothers tended to the wounds of travel, not knowing they would soon tend to the wounds of battle. Abbas, the lion of Banu Hashim, watched silently, his hand on his sword, waiting not for permission to fight, but for the command of his brother to protect, to serve. Ali Akbar's young face glowed with beauty and courage, while the infant Ali Asghar rested peacefully in the arms of his mother, still unaware that even he was not spared from the cruelty to come. The enemy did not attack on that day. They waited. They hoped pressure would force Hussain's hand. They tried politics, threats, and bribes, but the Imam's resolve did not waver. His silence was not out of fear, but out of strength. His restraint was not weakness, but wisdom. He was waiting for the world to witness what truth looked like in the face of power. He wanted the generations to come to know that when evil surrounds you, you do not run, you rise, even if the rising costs you your life. The circle around Hussain's camp grew tighter with each passing hour. The oppressive heat of the desert was now joined by the coldness of steel and the stares of soldiers who followed orders, not conscience. But inside the camp there was unity, there was faith, there was love. Hussain gathered his companions, briefed them, and gave them permission to leave, but not one soul departed. In a world that was closing in on them, their hearts opened wider in loyalty and conviction. The siege outside became a mirror to the strength within. The 2nd of Muharram was not just the arrival of Hussain to Karbala. It was the beginning of his encirclement. It was the day the world witnessed that sometimes, when falsehood feels it has power, it surrounds truth to suffocate it. But what it forgets is that truth, even when encircled, even when thirsty, even when wounded, still shines. The place where Imam Hussain A.S. would pitch his final tent, where the blood of the Prophet's family would soak the earth, and where the cries of children would rise into the heavens, was not chosen through maps, military intelligence, or human plans. It was Karbala, a barren, dry land with no natural defense, no rivers to protect, no walls to shield. And yet this was the place, decreed by Allah, to be the stage of the greatest moral stand in human history. Hussein's arrival on the 2nd of Muharram to this land was not a coincidence, and it was not forced merely by the enemy's military strategy. It was the fulfillment of a divine plan, a sacred prophecy coming to life, step by step, breath by breath. Long before Imam Hussain set foot on this earth, this land had already been marked. The Prophet Muhammad Letteref, DFA, years earlier, had wept upon being handed soil from Karbala by the angel Jibril, who told him that one day his beloved grandson would be martyred there. The Prophet held that soil to his chest, kissed it and cried. The companions saw it, the Ahlul Bayt knew it. And Hussein too knew. When he asked the name of the land and was told it was called Karbala, he whispered, "This is the place of our pain and affliction, Karb and Bola." It was as though his soul had reached the end point of its earthly journey, and his heart recognized the ground beneath him as the soil that would embrace him in martyrdom. Karbala was not rich with resources, it was not lush or inviting, it was thirsty like the fate that awaited the children of the Ahlul Bayt. But Allah does not choose locations for their beauty or strategic strength. He chooses them for their symbolism, for the story they will carry, for the message they will immortalize. Karbala was to be a canvas for divine truth, where each drop of blood would write a verse of resistance, and each fallen body would become a banner of eternal inspiration. The dust of Karbala would become more sacred than gold, and its silence would speak louder than sermons. Imam Hussain could have avoided Karbala. He could have turned away, changed his path, sought another route. But when the army of Umar ibn Sa'd intercepted him and forced him to halt in that very location, Hussain did not resist. He knew this was not a trap, it was the destination, and when his feet touched its soil, his heart whispered acceptance. This was not a battlefield, it was a shrine in the making. It was the meeting place of heaven and earth, where angels would descend and history would kneel. Those who surrounded the camp of Imam Hussain saw only dry land and easy victory. They thought the place would quickly become a forgotten footnote in the records of power. But Karbala was never for them. It was for the oppressed who would find hope in it, for the seekers who would find clarity in it, for the mourners who would cry in its remembrance, and for the believers who would rise in its spirit. It was the battlefield chosen by the Almighty, not to crush Hussein but to raise him, not to end his legacy but to begin it. The very ground they underestimated would become a sanctuary for truth till the end of time. In Karbala, geography bowed to destiny. The plain, which once stood empty, would be filled with the fragrance of sacrifice, and even the wind that blew across its dunes would carry the names of the martyrs in its breath. The birds that fly over it would witness to angels descending in reverence. The land that was once just soil would become sacred by the footsteps that walked upon it, and the blood that was spilled upon it, because when Allah chooses a place, He infuses it with a meaning that no army, no tyrant, and no history book can erase. On the 2nd of Muharram, when Imam Hussain A.S. arrived in the land of Karbala, there was no sound of clashing swords, no war cries, no bloodshed, only silence, a silence so deep it echoed the weight of destiny. The desert lay still, yet within that stillness, the greatest revolution in human history had already begun. It did not begin with war, it began with faith. It began with the calm determination of a man who knew that sometimes the loudest stand is made not with weapons, but with patience, prayer, and purpose. As the Imam dismounted and surveyed the empty plains, he understood exactly what Karbala meant. The Prophet _FDFA had spoken of this land. He had cried holding its soil, and now Hussein stood upon it, not as a general preparing for battle, but as a servant of Allah preparing for sacrifice. There was no army awaiting him, only the creeping shadow of one. Yet Hussein pitched his tents with the full knowledge that this soil would drink the blood of his family. That this ground would bear witness to pain so great, even the heavens would mourn, yet no complaint escaped his lips. There was no chaos, no desperation, no confusion. Instead, there was discipline, dignity, and silence. This was the silence of submission, not to injustice, but to the will of Allah. It was the silence of a man who knew he was right, and that his rightness did not need the noise of numbers or the illusion of power. It was the silence of trust, trust in the divine plan, trust in the truth he carried, trust in the promise that every drop of blood shed for Haq would echo for eternity. The patience of Karbala was not passive, it was powerful. It was the patience of the children who slept beside their mothers, unaware that the thirst would become unbearable. It was the patience of Lady Zainab, who watched the enemy surround them like a sea of cruelty, and yet stood tall like a mountain. It was the patience of Abbas, whose strength was unmatched, yet waited silently for the command of his brother. It was the patience of Ali Akbar, Qasim, and the companions who knew death was near but remained smiling in the face of fate. And above all, it was the patience of Hussein himself, a patience not born of weakness, but of clarity. He knew the time for the sword would come, but for now it was the time of preparation, of reflection, and of trusting Allah. He spent those early days in Karbala in worship, in teaching, in gentle reminders to the enemy about who he was and what Islam truly stood for. He didn't raise his voice, he raised his principles. Faith in Karbala did not flicker, it burned brightly. The faith of those 72 believers, including men, women, and children, was not shaken by the growing enemy that encircled them. Instead, it grew stronger. They were not waiting for a miracle of escape. They were ready to become the miracle itself. The kind of miracle that teaches humanity what it means to believe, even when every worldly reason says to surrender. The revolution of Karbala did not begin on the day of Ashura. It began the moment Hussein said no to Yazid. And that resistance came first in the form of calm, in the form of submission to truth, and in the form of quiet defiance. The silence that filled those first days in Karbala was not empty, it was sacred. It was filled with prayers whispered into the night, with the sound of Quran recitation carried by the wind, with glances exchanged between brothers, between fathers and sons, who knew they would soon become martyrs, but remained unshaken. This silence, this patience, this unbreakable faith, this was the first weapon of Karbala, and it was stronger than any sword.